Well, it's so wonderful to be in Adelaide, one of the most beautiful cities in Australia, one of my favourite cities in the world probably, and almost certainly my favourite cricket ground outside the UK. Adelaide Oval is just set in beautiful parkland. You walk to it along and across the Torrens River, and it just unfolds in the most scenic setting that you can possibly have. And I love coming here. It just seems to kind of fill you with that sense of history. And Jonathan Agnew, who is on his 9th Ashes tour, Stephen Finn, 3 times Ashes winner, 3 times Ashes tourist, who was part of the team that won here 11 years ago. TMS commentator Simon Mann on his 5th tour here, and to add statistical and historic context, Andy Saltzman, I'm sure, also delighted to be here in Adelaide. And Aggers, first of all, what's so special about Adelaide Oval? What makes it such a great place?
Well, it's a cricket ground. It's a proper cricket ground, as simple as that. I mean, so many of these grounds here in Australia, they're very impressive. They hold tens of thousands of people, but only this one and the WACA, which sadly is no more, at least for men's cricket. They're actually proper cricket grounds. And so this place, I first played here in 1978 when most of it was grass and you could actually walk around the ground and you could see the cathedral and so on. And so it's interesting coming back every so often since then and see how it's changed. And what's wonderful about that particular ground is that it's really strictly controlled by the planners here in Adelaide. I mean, this whole city is very historic and very traditional, very wide streets and so on, but they've been really meticulous about maintaining that proper feel about the Adelaide Oval, even though now it's a very modern stadium and obviously hosts Aussie rules as well. They've done it so well. I mean, they just have, and you can see straight down the park from our end. They've maintained the old scoreboard there, there's an electric one beside it. There's still plenty of grass. There's still a hill, which of course used to be Sydney's great domain, but that went years ago. But above all, it just feels like it's a very traditional, yet modern cricket ground, and that's what I love about it.
What was your first visit here like, Simon?
First visit here actually was for a game, bizarrely, between Australia and Australia A in the Tri-Series. Actually, I say Tri-Series, actually 4 teams involved. They didn't think England and Zimbabwe were strong enough in 94-5, so they put in Australia A as well. So Australia A against Australia, the day Australia played with itself. It was a strange occasion because Australia A nearly beat Australia. And I was looking actually at the Australia A team that day. Lehman, Hayden, Martin, Langer, Ponting, Tom Moody, Rifle, Merv Hughes.
Of course, a lot of rancour, didn't it? I remember the game well too. Both teams hated playing it because the main team didn't want to be beaten by Australia A. The Australia A team thought they should have been playing in the main team. It was a very strange setup.
But look how strong that Australia A team was. It was absolutely incredible. And basically, the Australian team was the test team. I had a look at that, and and in the end, they ended up playing in the final. But I remember playing the game being played here, and it was a great game actually because Australia just beat Australia A, but all the Australian supporters who were in were supporting Australia A. It was a really weird occasion. It was the whole series was really weird. I remember actually England beating Australia A in Melbourne, and it seemed like a massive victory because it was they had real slim pickings on that tour. Bizarre. I don't think it happened these days.
I think talking about the way it looks as well, and it's when I was growing up wanting to come to Australia, fascinated by cricket, it was the place I wanted to come to, I think because of the cathedral in the background, the hill, just that traditional element to it. But when I did first come here 4 years ago, Graham Swan, your old teammate Finney, was working with us, and we walked across and he said, they've ruined it because of the big stands that have built up, blocking the view of the cathedral. And it has changed an awful lot, hasn't it, since you played here in 2010?
Yeah, it has. It was a bit more quaint, I suppose, in 2010 on the far side of the ground. I think the only stand that was developed was the one that we changed in, and the rest of it was still as it was before then. But it's a magical sort of ground. Everything about it, the shape of the oval, it is literally an oval shape. It's really long and thin, which is quite strange for a cricket ground. So you have to alter the way that you play here. The wickets tend to be really flat, so it means that the test matches always last 5 days. It's like a social occasion as well. I've got some friends from Adelaide, and it's like going to the races or a day at the Lord's Cricket. You go there too.
Or Wimbledon too, actually. You've got a touch of Wimbledon about it, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. In the back, out the back, and vast areas where people just go and socialise and stuff. So, yeah, everything about it is quite a magical place, and obviously fantastic memories from that 2010 tour being the first game that we won in that series.
It's interesting, the comparison to Wimbledon, isn't it? Because you've got, I don't know whether it's Boston Ivy or Virginia Creeper or whatever it is, but it's some kind of creeper that's on the back of the stand where we were down next to the nets yesterday, Aggers, and the score box as well, just to be able to go into there. But you go into the old pavilion as well, and there is a fantastic display about Bodyline. And I remember doing that 4 years ago. We walked around that and looked at the history of it. And Andy Zaltzman, I kind of think it's something that we should probably just set the context of what happened in that Bodyline series, because it's one of the most notorious stories in cricket.
Yes, it was the third test of the series, and the series stood at 1-1 going into it. England started disastrously badly. They were 30 for 4 on the first morning, recovered to 341. When Australia batted, their captain Bill Woodfull was hit on the heart by a short ball from Larwood, and then later in the innings, Bert Oldfield, their wicketkeeper, was hit on the head after top edging an attempted pull shot, and it did sort of spark the diplomatic side of Bodyline. Reading the Wisden report from that match, it led to the dispatch of a cablegram protesting against Bodyline bowling. So it became a sort of proper diplomatic incident. Cablegrams in the 1930s, that's pretty much as serious as it got, really. So England ended up winning the game quite comfortably in the end, and they went on to win the series 4-1. So, but it was Adelaide where the sort of crowd erupted in protest, and things happened off the field. And there was that incident where Woodfull in the Australian dressing room, I think England's sort of tour manager Helen Warner went in, and Woodfull said there are two teams out there and only one of them is playing cricket, or words to that effect. And yes, again, by today's standards, it probably
That's strong words.
Yes.
I mean, it's worth making the point, actually, why it was so controversial. I mean, these days you wouldn't bat an eyelid short ball to any batter, really. But in those days, well, it was more, it was so directed, and because you could have more than two fielders behind square on the leg side.
Yeah, so I think some of the concern about it was not considered a fair tactic, bringing the batsman's body into play, and also that it led to cricket that wasn't great to watch, because the range of shots batsmen could play against that type of bowling was limited. So I think there was partly an aesthetic complaint about it. And I mean, I think, if I'm right, you might be able to back me up on this. I mean, when Oldfield was hit, I don't think the Bodyline field was in place. I think he was playing a pull shot, but when they had an offside field, but it was a spark, and he top edged it into his own head and had to be taken to hospital.
Of course, there are those who think Douglas Jardine is England's greatest ever Ashes hero. He came up with a plan to stymie Don Bradman, who still averaged 56 in the series.
You won't find many people in Adelaide thinking that. Actually, the one thing I want, before we move on from that, I would say that one of the other nice things about Adelaide Oval is that the statue of Don Bradman at the front does actually look like Don Bradman. It's on the walk from the cathedral to the ground. You don't often find a statue that looks like the subject that it's based on. But look, let's...
Yeah, the one in Sydney, there's a plaque in Sydney with a sort of 3D relief of Bradman that looks absolutely nothing like him. So obviously they prefer him here in Adelaide.
Anyway, let's bring it kind of slightly more up to date. Actually, maybe we'll jump forward. Let's jump forward to some good news, and that 2010 victory here, Finney, which you played in. What was it like to play in that game? What are your memories? First of all, of the very first over of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the wildest starts to a Test match that I've ever played in, I think. And the run out, Jonathan Trott aiming at one stump, and I was at fine leg, and I just remember coming round and I was almost behind him because I was going to cut off. When you back up, you sort of dovetail so that you run behind the other fielder, and he was at square leg. And he came round and I was perfectly behind, and I just saw it, and as soon as it came out of his hand I was like, that's hitting the stumps. This is phenomenal. Hits the stumps and he goes off doing his crazy celebration. Everyone hugs him, and then in the same over Graham Swan took a fantastic catch off Ricky Ponting, I think it was, like a low down to his right, and it was sort of that moment where you thought this could actually be something quite special. You obviously try not to get carried away, but in that moment, and then to have them 3 down very soon after, it was just the most incredible start to a Test match. And I mean, like England in the previous Test match that we saw here, had the worst possible start on the flip side. That for us just gave us so much momentum, and from there it was just it wasn't plain sailing, but you just felt like you're in the ascendancy from that beginning, that first over of the game.
What do you remember of that, Jonathan?
I remember Michael Clark running out of the nets because they were 0 for 2 almost, weren't they? And Clark was actually practicing in the nets beyond the pavilion, and so he literally ran from the nets out into the middle, didn't he? I mean, it was an extraordinary start. It was one of those games where things just went right. KP comes on to bowl at the end and gets Michael Clark in the second innings, and it absolutely hammered down with rain, pretty quickly after England had won the match as well, and there was sort of rain that would have meant no play. It was brilliant because they come from Brisbane, buoyed by that draw. Morale was very high, and it's one of those times when a draw is as good as a win, and Australia are a bit deflated from what happened at Brisbane, so England just cashed in. But it was a great win. I've only seen England win here once before that. So it is very rare. I mean, Australia have a great record here.
So it's quite interesting that you talk about teams being settled. Like, we just knew after the first test that the team was going to be the same for the second test, whereas there were so many question marks over Australia's bowling attack. Mitchell Johnson played the first one, didn't play the second one. Doug Bollinger got called in from state cricket to
Peterson
come and play.
Murdered him.
Peterson was just savage in that game. It was phenomenal batting. And you just felt as though you were in the ascendancy. It was a fantastic match to play in, and so many different little quirks about that game. There's such fantastic memories. The Clark dismissal, where it was almost disbelief that he'd just managed to edge such an innocuous short ball from Peterson onto his thigh pad, and it ballooned to short leg, and you're just like, what on earth is happening here? Like, I bowled a half tracker to Mike Hussey, and he just spooned it straight in the air to mid-on. Went for the entire previous Test match and the rest of the Adelaide Test match, he'd murdered it through mid-wicket. It just felt as though everything went right, and I think something people forget about that game, Stuart Broad got injured as well, and tore his side really badly and couldn't bowl, so it was me, Jimmy Anderson and Graham Swan pretty much just doing all of the bowling. I think that's why Peterson was bowling on that fourth evening, to give the rest of us a bit of a break. And then afterwards when the rain came, I remember Paul Collingwood we all sat in the dressing room having a beer because we had a gap between the second and third tests where we went off to Melbourne, I think, to play a warm-up game. So we were allowed to indulge ourselves slightly that night without fear of consequences in further Test matches, and just sat there having a beer, and all of a sudden Paul Collingwood runs through in his pants. Literally, his little wife sprints through the dressing room, and everyone's like, what is he up to? And he's making all this noise in his Geordie accent. Sprints up the concourse out onto the pitch and does a Klinsmann dive across the covers in the pouring rain, and it came back completely soaked. And one of my most vivid memories of that is just seeing Paul Collingwood, like little ginger fella, running back from the oval, completely soaked through. It was just that camaraderie that we had on that tour was different to, I think, any other tour that I went on as an England player. It was such a warped experience and a complete contrast to what I experienced in latter years.
Well, we should maybe move on to the latter years stuff, shouldn't we? And memories of Mitchell Johnson. Tell us about him, watching him bowl.
Well, Adelaide Oval is one of the few grounds in the world where you watch from side on. So if you're a batter, you're sat up in the viewing gallery and you're looking from side on, and Aggers will attest to this. I think Old Trafford, the quickest wicket when you played in the country before it got turned, you watched from side on. So you sort of sat there and you're watching from side on, you're like, I mean, someone bowling 63 miles an hour looks quick from side on, so let alone 93 miles an hour. And you see Johnson whistling in, and you don't see the ball come out of his hand, and the only thing you see is Brad Haddin just catching it above his head, and you think, oh, that's pretty fast. and it's like you're a gladiator just waiting to go out there and face your death sentence, because it's terrifying watching from side on, and it's one of the few grounds that you do that. And that series in 13-14, Johnson bowled magnificently. It was some of the best sustained fast bowling over the course of a series that I've witnessed live, for pace, accuracy, skill. And Adelaide Oval was the worst place to watch him because you were side on.
He took 7 for 40 in that Test match. The other amazing thing about that game Just look at the scores on first innings. Australia made 570, England 172. Australia did not enforce the follow-on. They had a lead of about 400 on first innings. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, you want to give your bowlers a bit of a rest, don't you? But I mean, it was just like a slow torture for that whole match. And I remember Hadding getting 100 in the first innings, and England was sort of in the game a bit. And I think he was dropped, really badly dropped, somewhere like backward point. Might even have been off you, Finney. I don't know. You were a very unlucky bowler at times. But
Always unlucky.
Yeah, but I mean, he was just phenomenal, wasn't he, in that series, Mitchell Johnson?
That was Ben Stokes' Test debut, the Adelaide Test match. I remember, I think he got Brad Haddin out off a no ball in that match before he'd got 100. And it's the first time, like, I'd heard of Stokesy. I'd been in an England ODI squad with him in 2011 when he first got called up to the team. But it was the first time that I'd witnessed live, like, his charisma and his character for someone making his Test debut. There'd be great photos of him. He got in a confrontation with Haddin on Test debut as a 21-year-old or whatever, 22-year-old or whatever he was, and stood up to him, who was one of Australia's main players. It's when you sort of like, okay, this guy's got something special about him and the character that you want from an all-rounder. Then he goes and scores that magnificent 100 in Perth, the Test match after.
As far as your memories of that kind of series, Aggers, and watching Mitchell Johnson.
Yeah, well, being a
then.
fast bowler, I mean, I love watching fast bowlers bowl, especially when you're 100 yards away in a commentary box. I remember Stuart Broad in that match walking out to bat, and he unwisely had a bit of a go at Mitchell Johnson. I think he and Jimmy, I seem to remember them walking off, I think when Johnson was batting at the end of play, and they both got involved in giving a real earful. I remember saying at the time, I'm not sure it's very wise. But then Stuart Broad came out to bat. He's not happy against fast bowling, as we know. And he picked out some spot, before he faced the ball, some spot on the sight screen. And it took forever for the ground staff to sort it out. And a bloke came with a ladder and put it up on the side of the screen and did something. It took forever. And we all knew what was going to happen. Sure enough, the bloke came down his ladder, put it away. Broad finally takes guard, gets over his bat, and Johnson came to the far end and just blew his stumps out of the ground first ball. I mean, that kind of summed it up. But I loved watching Mitchell Johnson, not least because of the great story. Really, it was a great sporting story. The way he turned his career around, albeit quite briefly, but to come back as he did was absolutely amazing. And to watch him in that game was clearly very special.
When we were talking about doing this podcast, Andy Zaltzman, you said, as long as I don't have to relive 2006, 2007, you're going to have to relive it now, I'm afraid. So just remind us of the extraordinary sequence of events.
Well, England had lost the first test. It was the series after their wonderful win in 2005, so defending the Ashes, and had a period of great success as a team. And in the second test, just having lost that first test, scored 551 for 6, declared. Collingwood made a double century, Peterson 158. England were in total control of the game. Took some early wickets. They had Australia 65 for 3 when Damien Martin was out. Ricky Ponting was dropped by Ashley Giles. I think it was deep square leg, wasn't it, from a pull shot, and he went on to make up 142. Australia recovered to 513. So England still had a lead, and you thought the game was heading towards a draw. The end of day 4, England were 59 for 1 from 19 overs, and so 100 odd ahead. And day 5 was a slow motion catastrophe for England. Shane Warne 4 for 49 from 32 overs. England only went at 1.7 an over, and bear in mind they scored at 3 an over for the first part of that innings. So on day 5, they just got constricted and tensed up. I remember watching it through the night alone at home as this just gradually unfolded, and it wasn't a sort of one of those spectacular collapses. It was wickets sort of gradually through the day and almost no runs whatsoever. All out 129 from 73. A couple of wickets for Lee. McGrath 2 for 15 from 10, and then Australia knocked off 168 in 33 overs to win by 6 wickets. But it was that tour ended in a 5-0 defeat. But at 1-0 down and having beaten Australia before and started that game so well, it felt like England had a chance of getting back into it. But that last day as an England fan was about as harrowing as it gets.
I did an event with Mike Hussey the other day, and he was in that Australia side, and he was saying that when they turned up on the 5th morning of the game, they were in the dressing room, Shane Warne and Ricky Ponting and John Buchanan, Australia's coach at the time, said, we can win this game. And Mike Hussey said he was at the back of the dressing room going, you what, mate? You must be absolutely mad. He was thinking, he didn't say it out loud. And they said, right, what are we going to do? Are we going to attack or are we going to defend? So are we just going to squeeze them? And in the end, that's what they did, didn't they? They squeezed them. They set quite defensive fields. England couldn't find a run. And they produced, a miracle victory.
But there was trouble because Matthew Hogarth got 7 for in the first innings, but bowling cutters. So it was one of those pitches where the ball was gripping. It wasn't easy to score at a rate. And so you knew, actually, that Warne could be a threat. So I guess that's what they took into that conversation.
The other thing about that game as well is that I remember actually being at home for this game. I was coming out later and screaming at my television, don't declare, when England declared on the second day. I mean, they'd just taken 50 runs off about 5 overs. Just get masses. Just get absolutely masses. I know they wanted to bowl at them before the close, and they did get Langer out. But I remember that was my instinctive reaction as they walked off at 5:50. OK, it's a good score, but don't declare. Just keep on going.
Vinny, do you remember watching that at home?
Yeah, that was one of the first Test matches that I ever really stayed up through the night to watch. I remember Collingwood scoring his double 100. And it was one of the first times that I saw England in the ascendancy in Australia, and especially after what happened in the first Test, you felt enthused by the way they started the game. But yeah, like sort of says, the slow motion car crash on day 5 sort of had you looking through your fingers through the night. But yeah, it's the first time that I properly stayed up through the night to watch England play on an overseas tour.
That final day, England 70 for 9 from 54 overs. In the first innings, Warne and McGrath between them won for about 270 and then destroyed England on that final day.
We should talk about Phil de Freitas, Aggers, shouldn't we, as well? Because that was... He won man of the match for his batting in 94-95.
That was 94-95, which is a really good game of cricket. That was the only other victory I've seen England pull off here. Yes, he got his man of the match for his batting, and Devon Malcolm and Chris Lewis actually bowled Australia out at the end. I think one of my clearest memories, though, is of the tour before that, when David Gower and Graham Gooch had spectacularly fallen out. Gower had flown his biplane up in Carrara. They actually waited till they got here to fine him for that. So the morale was absolutely rock bottom. And I'd had a running bet with Martin Johnson, who was writing those days, I think, for the Telegraph. I was trying to say, look, Martin, you don't deliberately bowl someone like David Gower's legs. You don't do it. And Martin can say, but he keeps getting out, caught down the legs. I said, I'm telling you, as a former international bowler, mate, you don't do that. I'm having a $10 bet with you that you just don't do it. And so the last over before lunch, sure enough, it was McDermott who bowled one down that leg stump line. Gower went swish and was caught by Merv Hughes about 10 yards in, deliberately placed. And the press box in those days was right beside the dressing rooms, outside, and the walkway was literally right beside the press box. And I remember as Gower walked off, a bit airily, Gooch went behind him with a face like absolute thunder, because they weren't talking anyway. And I just reached over and gave Martin the $10. Said, fair enough, mate. I think you probably know more about bowling than I do. But that was the real beginning of the end for Gower. And certainly it was the end of any sort of relationship that he had with Graham Gooch. It sadly sort of rather dribbles on to this day.
The remarkable thing about that series, though, Aggers, we had a look at it, is that Gower, before that innings, he got 100 in each of the 2 previous Test matches and 61 in the Brisbane Test match as well. So in a way, he was sort of entitled to...
It was a shambolic tour.
Yeah.
There were some people who to say they were sort of the antithesis of Graham Gooch as far as training and work hard, Wayne Larkins and go on. I mean, it was it was a hard work tour for Graham, and I just think he just got so frustrated by that biplane incident. There you go.